It's Christmas Eve, 1979, and the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan is in preparation, with the intentions of killing President Hafizullah Amin and establishing full political and military control over the country. This would be the start of a 10-year conflict that would leave both sides involved in an economic, financial, and a moral drought. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you the Soviet Union's very own Vietnam War, the Afghan-Soviet War. Alright, so of course an invasion of this magnitude had to have a reason, right? There would have to be a reason for the Soviet Union's seemingly spontaneous blitzkrieg attack. And for that reason, we have to go all the way back to the 1800s. You see, Great Britain and Imperial Russia have been fighting over Afghanistan for the past century, for the one reason of it having a geopolitical advantage. You see, the British just did not want the Soviets to have Afghanistan. Not only was it geopolitically important, but if the Soviet Union got control of Afghanistan, it would put them closer to the British colonies that were already in Pakistan and India. Not only that, but Afghanistan had valuable resources that the Soviet Union needed. So when the Soviet Union gained its independence from Britain in 1919, Russia was one of the first countries to establish diplomatic relationships with it. And another reason would be because of the Brezhnev Doctrine. But to help you understand that, we have to dig a little bit deeper. Starting in 1965, when the Democratic Party of Afghanistan was founded, they were in allegiance with Moscow and had heavy Marxist views. Throughout the years, the Soviet Union would not only fund them, but the country, to help them with financial instabilities, military aid, and economic growth, further expanding the socialist partnership. This, for the most part, would be disrupted in 1967, when the PDPA would split into two factions. The Parchamists, led by Babrak Kemal, and the Khalqis, led by Nur Tariki. Fast forward to the summer of 1973, when Mohammad Daoud, the former Afghanistan prime minister, would launch a successful coup against King Zahir and take power. And although Daoud was more nationalist than socialist, his coup depended on pro-military and political factions. Now, of course, with new rule, there's going to be new problems, right? The Parchamists would support Daoud in his coup, while the Khalqis refused to recognize the change in power. And with that came many revolts in the country. Daoud, trying to mitigate this threat, would try to steer Afghanistan away from Soviet influence and try to move us closer to the Western powers. And this right here was a big no-no for the Soviet Union. You see, the Soviet Union had established a socialist rule over Central and Eastern Europe, calling this section the Soviet bloc. Going back to the Brezhnev Doctrine, it states that if one country under socialist rule was under threat, all the countries would be under threat, and the Soviet Union would handle it however they saw fit. Now, with Afghanistan wanting to make allies with America, which was the Soviet Union's biggest op, they knew they needed to act fast in order to maintain a socialist country. And although Daoud would try his hardest to move away from the Soviet Union, it would all fail, because finally the Soviet Union would get tired of his antics, and in 1978, Daoud and 18 other members of his family would be killed in a coup that was started by the Soviet Union. Now, with an awkward shift in power, Hafizullah Amin would take control. And let me tell you, because the Soviet Union just could not hit, because it only got worse from here. Hafizullah Amin would be worse than Daoud, and he would completely ignore the Soviet Union. Not only that, he would purge the country and start executing people. And as the Soviet Union further and further lost their control over Afghanistan, a plan for an invasion was underway. Because throughout 1978 and 1979, the Soviet Union would send KGB soldiers into Afghanistan to infiltrate the bases. Not only would they infiltrate the bases, but they would try to gather intel, cut off military supply routes, and take over military airfields too. In turn, weakening the government for the attack that was yet to come. And decently important side note, it was believed that America was funding most of these Islamic groups through connections in Pakistan, which is honestly believable, because if you've ever seen how America conducts warfare, or warfare, it typically would consist of funding the guerrilla fighters or the government so that if you win, you like us more. But back on track, after much scouting and planning, the attack would finally commence. On Christmas Eve, 1979, the Soviet Union would overrun Afghanistan in such a unique way. They would do this by airdropping Soviet troops dressed as Afghani soldiers into Kabul, which was the capital city. They would cross over the border, and they would overrun major cities, all happening at once. This was, in fact, a blitzkrieg attack. They would mainly focus on the capital first, where Amin had inadvertently set up his base of operations at the palace. Not only that, but he brought all the top government officials to the palace too. So the Soviets, while they were there, surrounded the palace, cut off all communications, cut off all reinforcements, and by the time that they overrun the palace, it was too late. The Soviet Union later justifying this attack based on the 1978 Treaty of Friendship, now establishing a new puppet rule that was led by Babrak Kemal. Now, this is kind of known as the Soviet Union's very own Vietnam War because this is pretty much a strong country with a government versus a guerrilla force. We all remember how that went, right? And if you already know the whole Vietnam War, you're gonna read this whole conflict like a kindergartner's book. But just for context, the Soviet Union would immediately get their asses handed to them. Now, don't get me wrong, if it was tank on infantry, the Soviet Union would come out on top 10 times out of 10. But when it came to rural areas in the mountains where they couldn't use their tanks, the guerrilla forces that had already known the lands and known the tunnels that were especially in the mountains would cook the Soviet Union forces. Now, realize this, from an outside view, the Soviet Unions don't know who they're fighting. Entirely. All they know is that they're fighting the rebels. What they don't know is that they're fighting hundreds of other groups. So no matter what, around every corner, around every bend, inside every single nook and cranny, they were getting shot at. The Soviet Union, for the most part, would manage to keep some cities, but due to the sheer amount of forces that would overrun the cities, they could not keep control. And realize this all could have been prevented, because even most of the Soviet leaders said, hey, don't invade Afghanistan, this is what's gonna happen. And what do you think happened? Exactly what they said would happen. The guerrilla fighters would smack them daily. At the most, the Soviet Union would only have control of 20% of Afghanistan. And just to help you understand that, by 1979, the population of Afghanistan was 13 million people. 20% of 13 million is 260,000. They only had control of 260,000 people. And by the time the Soviet Union would finally send spies into the rebel groups and find out what they were truly dealing with, they would be shocked. Because like I said, from the outsider view, they had discovered that not only were they fighting one rebel group, but hundreds. And let me say this, Afghanistan had just cooperated together just to kick the Soviet Union out of their country. Please understand what I just said there. Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires because they can never get along, at least in a solid government. The Soviet Union fucked up so bad that they managed to unfuck up a country just to get fucked up. It's beyond hilarious. Like, I fucking laugh at that shit because they truly fucked up so bad that they got a country of people who could not coexist, who could not live without wars, to cooperate and fight you. By 1980, the Soviet Union had found themselves in constant threat in Kabul. And by 1981, they just completely would avoid it. By this time, it seemed that every 5 steps the Soviets took, they had to take 15 steps back. Now, don't get me wrong. Let me not just go ahead and say the guerrilla fighters were winning all this and there. Like I said, the Soviet Union was winning for the most part, but they're guerrilla fighters. They're gonna lose at some point. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, that's just like going to Texas and trying to run shit. You will get fucked up within the first 5.5 seconds. So by 1985, the Soviet troops would start to gradually be pulled out. It's at this time, too, where the Soviet Union also tries training the government because they're going to abandon them, and they're definitely going to die. So, hey, you might as well just try to train them, right? Try to defend yourself. And by 1991, all the Soviet forces would have officially left Afghanistan, and the rebels would have officially won, further solidifying the Soviet Union's heavy loss in the Soviet-Afghan War. By the time the rebels had taken over Afghanistan, it was back in its perpetual state of economic collapse. This conflict would sadly leave 1 million civilians dead, as well as over 120,000 Soviet and rebel troops dead too. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be known as the Soviet Union's very own Vietnam War. A war that ended as swiftly as it started. This was, and will forever be known as, the Soviet-Afghan War. You guys have a good day and a good night. Peace. Wake up, filthy.